Hey guys, tonight we're headed into the flour-dusted shadows of a medieval bakery, long before sourdough became a trend, and back when bread was closer to a social contract than a snack. You're not just walking into a kitchen, you're entering a room where the walls sweat heat, the floor crunches with grains, and the smell of yeast practically climbs into your lungs. You're here before the sun because bakers had to be. The rest of the town is still asleep, but in this dim stone room, there's already movement. You push open a heavy oak door and a waft of warm, tangy air hits your face. Someone nearby sniffs the breeze coming through a small arched window, holds a lump of dough thoughtfully, and nods. He doesn't speak, just points to the sky as if it's whispering something. This, believe it or not, is the moment where wind becomes everything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slide onto a bench near the hearth. The baker doesn't look at you yet. He's watching the flour settle, observing how it drifts. The air's different today. Slightly wetter. The flour clumps faster, that's not great. See, in the Middle Ages, bakers didn't just toss ingredients together and hope for the best. They were attuned to the environment like woodland animals. They measured the wind not with high-tech tools, but with their skin, their noses, and with terrifyingly keen attention. The yeast back then was wild, alive, unpredictable, and whether it behaved kindly or stubbornly could depend entirely on a breeze from the east. You lean back and breathe deeply. The scent is earthy and raw, and underneath it all is this warm, sour note. Yeast doing its slow, bubbling work. If the wind comes from the wrong direction, the dough might ferment too quickly. From the right direction, it rises like a choir, but no wind? That's trouble. Some cities, Paris, London, even Bruges, developed entire baking schedules around typical wind patterns. Mornings were good for white loaves, afternoons better for rye. And if you lived somewhere coastal, like Ghent, the maritime winds could turn your dough into soup if you weren't careful. There's a tale, unconfirmed, but gently whispered among bakery historians, that a certain guild in Lübeck had a man whose entire job was to sleep near an open window and wake the bakers if the wind changed after midnight. The baker's barometer, they called him. Not the most glorious title, but it beat being a tanner. Historians still argue whether this wind-sniffing obsession was grounded in solid science or just an elaborate ritual turned tradition. But they agree on one thing. Baking back then was not a passive job. It was delicate, dangerous, and extremely susceptible to even minor atmospheric quirks. You glance toward a small wooden plaque hanging by the oven. It shows a diagram, almost like a compass, with symbols drawn on it. That, you realize, is a wind sign. Today's reading is soft southern draft. The baker grunts. That means slower rise but smoother crust. He begins kneading with broad, even strokes, elbows deep in a cloud of flour. There's no mixer, no timers, only intuition and the slight tilt of his head as though he's listening to something just beyond your hearing. Is it the fire crackling, the birds, the breeze? You don't know. What you do know is this. You wouldn't survive this job for an hour. Not because of the labor, but because of the constant balancing act, judging whether the dough feels light enough, whether the crust might blister under a sudden draft, Whether the church bell that just rang might coincide with a shift in temperature. You look around and see sacks of grain. They're labeled not just by type, wheat, barley, spelt, but by season. Autumn rye, spring wheat. Why? Because even the same grain could behave differently depending on how dry or windy the season had been when it was harvested. A new baker enters, young, flushed with effort. He carries a tray of damp cloths and covers a series of wooden bowls lined with sticky dough. He glances at the window, frowns, and murmurs something to the head baker. You catch one word: gust. That's never good. There's a long pause as the head baker kneels near the oven, adjusting the flame with a long iron rod. And then, in an unexpected moment of vulnerability, he stands and sighs, "Might have to delay." "Delay what?" you ask softly. "The rise," he mutters. Too still, nothing's moving. He gestures toward the window. "Can't trust a loaf to rise when the wind is quiet. It's like it's holding its breath." And just like that, you get it. In this quiet place where bread feeds a village and a collapsed loaf means shame or worse, the wind is not just air. It's a clock, a mood, and sometimes a warning. And as the dough sits silently beneath its linen shrouds, you can almost hear it exhale. You're still seated near the hearth, watching the linen-covered bowls rise, or rather, not rise, beneath the tense glances of your bakers. The air feels heavier now, stiller. It's a strange thing to realize how deeply your fate might rest on the breeze. But here, in this flower-scented sanctuary, bread is everything. And bread, oddly enough, obeys the wind. See, in medieval Europe, bread wasn't just a staple. It was currency, identity, and risk all at once. The law took loaves very seriously. In fact, it might surprise you to learn that the wrong loaf could land a baker in prison. Or worse. Let's say you're a baker in 14th century London. It's just past the Black Death years and everyone's a little twitchy. You've got your dough ready, the oven roaring, and the smell, oh, the smell, wafting down the street like edible salvation. But then, a sudden gust of wind changes the moisture level in your bakery. Your crust overcooks. The bread weighs a few grams less than it should. You know what that means? You've just violated the assize of bread. This real piece of legislation, first implemented in the 13th century, dictated everything from the ingredients to the precise weight of a loaf. And if your loaf came up light, you weren't getting a warning. You were facing fines, public shame, and occasionally time in the stocks. Imagine that, being pelted with rotten cabbages because your crust cracked a little too fast in dry air. It gets better, or worse depending on your sense of humor. The weight regulations adjusted based on grain prices, which were themselves deeply affected by the weather, harvest, and yes, wind. So now, not only are you baking under pressure, you're baking under inflation with nature whispering sabotage at your window. Historians still debate whether the enforcement of these bread laws was consistent. Some argue local officials were harsh and theatrical, while others believe many bakers paid informal bribes in coins or crusts. But it's not just law you had to fear, it was public trust. Bread was symbolic. If a loaf cracked oddly, if the crust looked rushed, if it felt too light, neighbors would whisper. A baker could gain or lose reputation based on how the wind had treated them that morning. And while we're on that, remember, no one had clocks, no thermometers, no proofing drawers with precise heat. Instead, you judge your dough by feel, by smell, and by how the air moved through the rafters. That meant a good baker had to become a human barometer. There's a lovely, slightly ridiculous document from a Florentine guild that outlines an early apprenticeship oath. Alongside swearing to keep secrets of flour mixtures and oven stacking techniques, the apprentice had to learn to feel the morning with the hands, not the eyes. You let that line settle in your brain for a moment. Feels poetic, or like something a Jedi Master might whisper before handing you a very stale baguette. Still, you get the point. Bread was power. But fragile power. Imagine you're a city official responsible for feeding thousands. There's no refrigeration, no mass storage. You can't import flour from halfway across the world. Your people rely on their daily loaves. If wind disrupts baking citywide, that's not just inconvenient, it's a crisis. There are even quiet rumors of townsfolk blaming famine on wind witches who curse the ovens with stifling stillness. Absurd, yes, but also deeply telling. The wind, unseen and unpredictable, became a force of suspicion. And let's talk about those ovens for a second. They're not modern, not even close. A medieval oven was often communal, a massive dome of clay or brick fired with wood. The floor had to be scraped clean of embers the timing guessed by the heat left behind. You didn't insert a thermometer. You waved your hand near the opening and hoped your skin didn't blister too fast. So imagine this. You're baking 40 loaves in a narrow window of time, using a wild yeast starter that behaves like a moody cat. The dough is sensitive, the temperature inconsistent, and now the wind is wrong, causing an uneven rise. That's not just a bad day, that's a career-ending Tuesday. Bakers developed odd coping strategies. One popular trick? Hanging a strip of oiled parchment by the oven door to watch its flutter. If it swayed too hard, the baker would delay shaping the dough. If it didn't sway at all, he might spike the flour with a pinch of ash, believing the bitterness would slow fermentation just enough to survive the stillness. Quirky? Yes. Effective? Maybe. Some bakers swore by it. You glance back at your silent dough bowls. There's a faint bump beneath one cloth. A tiny rise. Not enough to bake yet, but the yeast is trying. You smile to yourself. It's a strange world, this one you've wandered into. A world where bread has politics, personality, and enemies like humidity. You lean back. The hearth crackles. The baker stretches his back and sighs, muttering something about north gusts being better for sour loaves. It sounds ridiculous until you realize he's not wrong. And suddenly the phrase baking is a science feels like an understatement. Here in this wind-watching world, it's part science, part ritual, and all survival. You're still seated on the low bench near the hearth, half warmed by the oven's soft glow, and half hypnotized by the quiet rhythm of the baker's hands. They've begun to move again, slowly, cautiously, like sailors testing the sea after a storm. The wind has shifted just a touch, and that's enough for now. Outside, a pale streak of dawn is starting to show through the bakery's small arched window, and you notice a shift in the air. Not temperature, not scent, pressure. You can't see it, but you can feel it, like the room itself is exhaling. The bakers, too, sense it. Without speaking, they begin to uncover the bowls, prodding the dough with their fingertips and nodding approvingly at its subtle, bubbly resistance. Why does this matter? Because in medieval Europe, when bakers were obsessed with measuring wind, they weren't only looking for direction or speed, they were watching for pressure shifts too. You might be thinking, hang on, they didn't have barometers in the 13th century. And you'd be right. But they had intuition, repetition, and a lifetime of baking under open rafters. You're handed a bowl, its contents soft and sticky. As you press your fingers into the dough, a faint hiss escapes. Trapped air. It's alive. The yeast has done its work. But why now? What changed? Answer: the air pressure dropped. Just slightly. Modern bakers know this well. Barometric pressure affects fermentation speed. High pressure, slower rise. Low pressure, faster, gassier, sometimes too fast. Medieval bakers didn't have the science, but they had patterns. And one of the biggest clues they followed was wind behavior. Historians still argue whether they understood this connection directly or simply built superstitions around it. Some point to old monastery records referencing heavy air mornings and light air days, both of which correspond eerily well with modern atmospheric changes. Others argue it was all just observation baked into habit. Either way, the wind was their signal. You look around the room again. There's no glass on the window, only a thin linen curtain, now trembling ever so slightly. That subtle movement is enough to tell the master baker that the pressure outside is dropping. Time to shape the loaves, and so the dough is portioned. No scales, just practiced hands. The bakers shape with palms and fingers, flattening and folding, then rolling the loaves with a soft thud onto wood trays. They move fast, but not rushed. They're not following a clock. They're following the air. At this point, someone makes tea, or, more accurately, pours warm barley water, murky and bland, but oddly comforting. You sip it as the loaves rise once more, this time on broad wooden paddles near the oven's open mouth. One baker, you notice he's the oldest, leans toward the opening and tosses a pinch of flour upward. The powder spirals in the heat like smoke, then dissipates. He nods. You learn this is a test, the flour float, a way to judge not just temperature, but how evenly the oven is breathing. Yes, breathing. Ovens like this didn't operate on dials. They worked like lungs, breathing in air and exhaling heat through their stone curves. If the flour rises and falls slowly, the pressure is right. If it shoots upward or drops like a stone, something's off. You begin to see why bakers talk to ovens like they were old friends or mild enemies. Then someone mentions the wind day of 1284. Now this gets your attention. The wind day, as they call it, was recorded in the annals of a town in western Germany. Part record, part legend. One early autumn morning, the wind simply stopped. Completely. No breeze, no draft, not even the usual shifting currents that snuck through alleyways. The sky was clear, the sun bright, but the air hung thick and motionless over the town for almost 36 hours. And the bread? Flat. Lifeless. Gummy in the center and rock hard around the edges. Bakeries across the town failed their loaves. Riots didn't break out, but there was panic. Bread was that important. Some bakers blamed the flour, others the firewood. But one man, a monk named Fridolin, recorded simply, "There was no wind to wake the dough." The breath of God had paused. Poetic. Slightly dramatic, but somehow fitting. That story stuck. So much so that in some towns they began recording wind days in their baking logs. If 3 days in a row showed slow rise and heavy air, bakers would lower output, adjusting their schedules and even their grain-to-water ratios to accommodate. Because of wind. Or more precisely, because of how the wind told them the pressure was changing. You think back to modern life, of thermostats, timers, smart fridges, and precision scales. It's humbling to know that these bakers, with no tools but their eyes, noses, and floating flour, managed to bake loaves that fed entire cities. As the first shaped loaves are slid into the oven, you feel the heat rise, curling softly around your feet. There's no rush. The wind has returned, barely, but enough. And the dough, resilient, fermented, finally ready, surrenders to the flames. A soft hum of approval passes through the room. The day has begun, and once again you're reminded they weren't just bakers, they were listeners, interpreters of air, whisperers of wind. The smell begins to change. You don't notice it at first because you're still in that gentle half trance brought on by the barley water, the fire's warmth, and the soft shuffle of feet on stone. But then it hits you, sweet, nutty, faintly toasted. The scent of browning crust, rising slowly from the oven like a memory you didn't know you had. The loaves are in. Now comes the waiting. But this isn't idle waiting. Not in a medieval bakery, this is the most delicate part. You glance over to the oven again. There, just to the right of the opening, is something unexpected. A small wooden frame mounted to the wall with what looks like a tiny cloth banner inside. It shifts when the wind moves, ever so slightly. A baker taps it once with his knuckle and mutters, "East-north. Dry side." Whatever that means. What you're looking at's a wind compass, or at least the medieval idea of one. These weren't fancy brass instruments. They were homemade devices made of feather tips, strips of dyed cloth, sometimes thin parchment soaked in oil to capture airflow without burning. Some were mounted near the oven. Others were hung in doorways or windows, twitching like sleepy cats reacting to ghosts. And here's the thing. They actually worked because they weren't measuring wind speed. They were measuring wind influence. The way air moved in and out of a room, the way a breeze might suck too much heat from an oven's mouth or introduce moisture into the dough you just shaped. See, in these stone bakeries, airflow was everything. If the door to the street stayed open too long, the temperature would shift. If the wrong window was left unlatched, it could introduce dampness. Tiny changes, yes, but in a world without thermostats, tiny was the difference between a loaf and a lump. So the baker's wind compass became as vital as a carpenter's square or a sailor's sextant. Every morning, before even lighting the oven, the master baker would check the wind. Not just where it was coming from, but what it felt like. Some towns had rules: if the wind came from the east, use less water. From the north, bake smaller loaves. From the south, expect a slightly faster proof. It wasn't science, at least not yet, but it was something closer. Craftsmanship seasoned with superstition and 1,000 mornings of trial. You ask one of the apprentices what they do if the wind is completely still. He gives you a crooked smile and says, "Complain quietly." There's a moment when the wind dies entirely, just briefly. The cloth flag in the wooden frame stops. The air in the bakery grows still, not hot, just motionless. You don't realize how much you rely on movement until it stops, and then you see it. The flames in the oven flutter, confused. The smoke draws backward just a little. One of the loaves cracks too early, small but telling. The head baker clicks his tongue and adjusts a stack of wooden paddles near the opening. No panic, but there's a change in posture now. They've been through this before. You notice a second wind gauge near the ceiling, a strip of rabbit skin tied to a beam. It curls when the air dries out. Today, it stays limp. Moisture is rising. There's something charming and slightly absurd about all this. Bakers treating rabbit hide like a barometer. But you realize quickly, whatever worked, stuck. It didn't matter if it came from an old wives' tale or some monk's fever dream. If a tool helped predict the oven's mood, it earned its place. Historians still debate the accuracy of these wind-reading tools. Were they genuinely effective or more like comforting rituals? One camp argues that these tools were early meteorological thinking, a practical response to environmental challenges. The other side insists they were little more than flour-covered fidget spinners. But both agree medieval bakers believed in them, and belief when practiced daily becomes method. In Florence, records suggest that guild bakeries even standardized wind readings. They'd post a chart, hand-inked, on a wooden slab showing recommended flour types by wind condition. A gentle east wind? Mix in rye. A humid northern breeze? Stick to hard wheat. Some bakeries even had names for specific currents. Saint's breath was a dry, warming draft that helped crusts bloom early. Devil's shoulder meant unexpected cold spots. You like that one? Devil's shoulder sounds like something you'd blame for all of life's minor annoyances. Cold tea, damp socks, loaf collapse. Back in the bakery, a young boy slips outside, holding a rag and a feather. He walks to the alley and lifts the feather, letting it drift. Then he spits lightly into the wind and watches how far it sails. You blink. Was that normal? Yes, absolutely. In fact, spitting into the wind was a common practice among journeyman bakers. It was a quick way to gauge not just direction, but resistance. If the spit flew sideways too far, the wind was strong enough to cool the oven prematurely. If it dropped like a stone, humidity was up. Charming, number useful, apparently. And all of this, every cloth flutter, every feather twitch, every weathered parchment nailed above the oven, it's all pointing to one truth. The wind wasn't just outside, it was inside the work, inside the dough, inside the crust, and somehow now inside your head, like a lullaby written in flour and fire. You're beginning to feel like you've earned a small apprenticeship badge just by sitting here, absorbing the rhythm of this wind-whispering world. The loaves now emit that familiar popping sound, crust crackling, cooling in the early morning air like a sigh escaping a warm bed. But before you can fully drift into that comforting symphony of baked silence, someone pulls you aside. They want to show you the monastery ovens. You follow the baker down a cobbled lane, away from the street's quiet bustle and toward a set of heavy wooden doors, tucked beneath the ancient stone archway of a Benedictine monastery. The smell is different here. Less yeasty, more herbal. Dried lavender and mint hang from a beam. The air is drier, quieter, more disciplined somehow. When you enter the baking room, you immediately sense it. This place is different. The ovens are smaller, built into the wall with perfect symmetry. Tools are stacked with painful precision. And above everything hangs a plaque, burned into oak, reading, Ora lege panem. Pray, read, bread. In monasteries, baking was ritual, not just work. Each loaf was sacred, an act of devotion as much as nourishment. But here's where it gets oddly scientific. Monks recorded everything. The wind, the cloud cover, the mood of the dough. They wrote down fermentation times next to psalms. They measured crust color against biblical metaphors. They even annotated air currents using tiny margin sketches of birds or leaves to symbolize draft strength. If the feather they hung beside the hearth turned east during matins, that loaf might be a little overproofed by prime. Adjustments were made accordingly, flour ratios, kneading times, baking durations, all written in neat Latin ink on wax tablets. Historians still argue whether these notations were purely spiritual metaphors or early baking analytics disguised as devotion. Some say the monks saw divine signals in nature. Others believe they were just data nerds in robes. One quirky entry from a 14th century Scottish abbey reads, Brother Aidan reports, no breeze at Lauds, crust likely to sweat. Will underbake 3 minutes and confess if needed. You can't help but grin. Back in the present, one monk, his face warm with flour, hands you a tiny loaf no larger than your fist. It's dense, speckled with fennel, and still steaming slightly. He doesn't speak much, but he taps the wall beside the oven. There, engraved in chalk, is a wind rose. 8 points, labeled not with directions, but with moods. Joy, sleep, dry, rise. Still, cough, sing, and hold. You tilt your head. Cough? He nods solemnly, points to his nose, then to the flower in the air. Too dry, too dusty. Bad for breathing, and apparently bad for dough. If you can't breathe, neither can your yeast. This idea that air and bread were not only related but symbiotic was common here. The monks believed that breath itself carried the life force of dough, and that wind was God's own exhale. A still day wasn't a failure, it was a test. You sit beside a narrow window where two birds perch on a crooked branch. One flaps its wings briefly, sending a breeze through the gap. Inside the room, the corner of a hanging cloth lifts. The monk nods approvingly. It's enough. Loaves are placed carefully into the oven. No shoving, no loud clanging. The fire is coaxed, not stoked. A wooden paddle moves like a prayer. Even the ash is swept with reverence. It's meditative. You start to understand how someone could do this for years, decades even. The act of baking in the monastery wasn't just survival, it was a conversation with the ingredients, with the air, and with the silence. There's a curious tool in the corner, a narrow glass-like funnel with a feather inside. It sways slowly. It's a proto-anemometer, or more accurately, an anemofathometer. You laugh softly at your own joke. But truly, this was their weather vane. Not for storms or gales, but for how the room felt. Back in the village bakeries, you'd never find this level of delicacy. There, it was about volume, consistency, and customer expectation. Here, it was one perfect loaf, or none at all. Another monk arrives. He whispers something in Latin, and the others nod. You catch only one word, mahatatayo, change. The wind shifting again. Without a word, they begin adjusting their preparations for the next batch. Bowls are rearranged, windows adjusted by the width of a thumb. The monk beside you picks up a book, not a scripture, but of fermentation notes. He flips to a page marked only with a pressed lavender sprig and jots something next to a sketch of a rising loaf. You glance again at the 8-point windrose on the wall. The cloth has shifted towards sing. Apparently, that's a good thing. And now you understand. While most people of the era feared the wind, associated it with storms, disease, or curses, these monks embraced it. They listened to it, named it, baked with it, and in doing so, they quietly turned unpredictable nature into divine rhythm. The ovens hum, the feather turns, and your eyes grow just a little heavier. You leave the monastery as the morning thickens into something golden and lazy. The world outside is still cool, but there's a dampness to it now. Air hanging like steam above warm cobblestones. You retrace your steps toward the village bakery where the loaves are just beginning to emerge from their dome oven. There's a smell now that's entirely different from earlier. Less sour, more roasted. Nutty crusts break like soft wood when tapped. Bakers line them up along the counter, inspecting each one with solemn precision. Not all loaves made it. A few are too pale. A few have split in odd places. a telltale sign of an uncooperative atmosphere. But today, no one gets fined. They've weathered the still air well. Still, everyone remembers what happened just a few years ago on the day the wind refused to rise. The senior baker tells the story again because of course he does. You settle on your usual bench, barley water in hand, and let the tale float over you like a lazy breeze. It was early autumn. The air was warm, sure, but too consistent. Not a leaf stirred, he says, which might sound poetic until you realize how uncanny that is in a village built on hills and drafty stone buildings. By breakfast, bakers began whispering. No one's dough was rising. Even the starters, those bubbly living ancestors passed down for decades, were going dormant. The yeast had stalled. By mid-morning, ovens across the village sat empty. Loaves that did go in came out dense, underbaked, gummy inside with dry, colorless shells. The kind of bread that makes you question your existence. Town records from that week show a sudden rise in complaints and in stew sales. Because what do you do when your bread turns into brick? You soak it. That's what. People were upset, but more than that, confused. How could every baker in the town miscalculate on the same day? That's when they noticed the air. Still, dense, motionless. The village priest, clearly unnerved, called for prayers. Meanwhile, the bakers compared notes. Every one of them reported the same signs: flat dough, pale crusts, and a strange sense of heaviness in the room. One baker even wrote, "The air would not open. Our fires grew sluggish. The dough did not sing." That last line sticks with you. The dough did not sing. Because normally, when everything goes right, a loaf crackles as it cools. Little micro pops that sound like a lullaby to the trained ear. But not that day. No cracks, no singing. Historians still debate whether this event was caused by unusual atmospheric pressure, a heat inversion, or simply a series of psychologically reinforced coincidences. In other words, did the bread fail, or did the bakers believe it would fail and create a self-fulfilling prophecy? But the locals? They had their own theory. They blamed the wind, not just its absence, but its defiance. Some said the wind had been offended. Others claimed it had been borrowed by a neighboring village for their harvest prayers. One child supposedly declared that the wind had gone away to sleep. Honestly, not the worst idea. In response, a few bakers began experimenting. They created wind lures, bunches of feathers tied to wire hoops, hung outside windows to encourage air movement. Did it work? Not really, but it felt like doing something. Others turned to more unusual rituals. One baker in particular, old Jonet, claimed she could sing the rise back into the air. Her chant involved humming while kneading and ending every sentence with a rhymed couplet. Was she mocked? Oh, yes. But did her loaves rise that week? Also, yes. You take another sip of your barley drink, lukewarm now, and realize something strange. For all their reverence, regulation, and ritual, these bakers were never quite in control. They were improvisers, reading the air like a mood, adapting to every twitch of the breeze, hoping their instincts were in tune with the invisible temperament of the atmosphere. In a way, it makes perfect sense that they became a little superstitious. You picture it, waking every day before dawn, eyes blurry, hands raw from work, praying the wind would play along today. Because when it didn't, you weren't just annoyed, you were in trouble. Legally, financially, reputationally, there were real stakes in a ruined loaf. And so, over time, the wind became personified. A guest to be courted, a friend to be kept in good humor, a trickster sometimes, a punishment rarely, and on days like that infamous still day, a ghost. Even now, years later, you can feel a strange hush descend over the bakery as the tale ends. The younger bakers nod solemnly, like they're half afraid it might happen again. The head baker breaks the silence with a joke, of course. Something about how if the wind ever goes missing again, he'll just start offering discounts on very dense artisanal bricks. Everyone laughs. You do too, but you glance at the feather in the corner, and for just a moment, it's still, perfectly still. You blink, and then it twitches. A breeze slips through the window, and every baker in the room breathes quietly as if they've just dodged something ancient. You're finally starting to understand something that's been floating around you like flour dust since you first entered this world of dough and drafts. Wind in this place isn't a detail, it's a character. And sometimes it's the villain, especially when the bread police come knocking. Yes, you heard that right. Bread police. They didn't carry swords. Well, not usually. But they had scales, ledgers, and most terrifying of all, authority backed by law. The assize of bread, first established in England in 1266, gave local officials the right to regulate everything from the size and price of a loaf to its exact weight in ounces and its purity. And if the loaf didn't measure up, you were in for a world of trouble. Now imagine this. You're a medieval baker. You've been up since 3 a.m. The wind's been fussy all morning, first too strong, then too still. You adjusted your water, tried a new kneading rhythm, even hummed that silly wind chant Jonette made up. The bread looks okay, maybe a little light. But then you hear them, the inspectors, or as some towns called them, the aleconers of bread. They wore long robes, serious faces, and carried official baskets. Inside the baskets? Weights. Not modern ones, but chunks of lead, measured by local standards and never quite the same from one town to the next. You'd watch them step into your bakery, brush the flour from your scales, and place one of your loaves against their benchmark. If your loaf was too light, even by a crumb, you paid a fine. Sometimes in coin, sometimes in bread, and occasionally in public humiliation. There are records of bakers being paraded through the streets with underweight loaves hung around their necks, forced to wear signs that read things like, "Short in flour, long in shame." One tale from Norwich speaks of a baker who had to stand in a cage next to the town's fountain, pelted with stale crusts by children for selling air bread. A loaf with too many bubbles and not enough substance. Now, here's where it gets wonderfully absurd. The baker swore his innocence. He insisted the dough had risen properly, but the wind had dried the crust too quickly, fooling the scale. Historians still argue whether he made that up or genuinely believed it. But the case created a local ordinance. All bread inspections must account for crust firmness on windy days. You can't make this up. And it wasn't just about weight. The bread assize included rules about price, too. Rules that fluctuated depending on grain supply, region, and season. And since grain supply was affected by, you guessed it, weather and wind, prices could jump unexpectedly. That meant bakers had to perform mental calculus at dawn, calculating how much flour to use, how many loaves to bake, what size and what shape, all while trying to guess what the inspectors would tolerate that day. It was a system ripe for anxiety. Some bakers kept notebooks hidden beneath the flour sacks, tracking the moods of inspectors, their preferred times, even which loaves seemed to pass more often. You're reminded strangely of kids trying to figure out which teacher is grading which part of their essay. Others took a riskier route, bribes. usually in the form of soft, perfectly crusted loaves set aside under a linen cloth. Off the official tray, of course. A wink, a nod, a loaf that fell off the ledger. Everyone knew, no one said anything. Except when they did. A scandal in 15th century Bruges involved a baker named Renard, who allegedly added sawdust to his flour to stretch it. He blamed his poor quality loaves on malicious winds that soured the yeast. The inspectors didn't buy it. He spent 2 nights in the public pillory, holding a sign that read, "I sold bark as bread." Even so, his bakery reopened a month later. People still bought his loaves, because, as one old woman reportedly said, "Even bark's better than no bread." But not every city punished failure with shame. Some, like certain towns in Italy, developed community baking systems, where ovens were shared and the risks distributed. In these places, wind readings were posted publicly, and bread inspections accounted for the day's weather. They even had wind calendars, sketched with folk symbols: a cat for dry wind, a snail for damp, a rooster for sudden gusts. These systems were more forgiving, but the fear of the bread police lingered. Even here in this bakery beside you, the tension rises when the loaves are being weighed. Not because someone's guilty, but because everyone knows that a loaf is never just a loaf. It's a contract. Between baker and buyer, between law and air, between a profession and the elements. As the head baker gently places a finished loaf on the scale and tilts his head, you realize he's not just checking weight. He's watching how the crust responds to pressure, how it sings when tapped. That tiny sound, a soft talk, tells him it's safe. He exhales. You didn't notice he'd been holding his breath. And you realize so had you. In a world where bread keeps the peace and feeds the crowd, every crumb counts. And the wind? The wind can be the difference between fame and fines. The loaves cool. The scales are balanced. No one's being publicly shamed today, and the feather by the door is finally resting, barely twitching, content. For a moment, everything in the bakery feels like it's in its proper place. But that doesn't mean the work is over, not by a long shot, because medieval baking, unlike the modern preheat mix bake routine, was a relentless dance of observation, correction, and minute-by-minute decisions. And most of those decisions depended on the wind. You stay seated on the flour-dusted bench, watching the bakers prepare the second batch of dough. There's no break here, just a different kind of energy, less frantic, more focused. The ovens are still hot. The air is changing again. And now begins the hardest part: timing the rise. See, shaping the dough is like sending your child off to school and just hoping they don't embarrass you in front of the whole town. Once it's shaped and covered, the dough becomes its own creature. Temperamental, silent, and always on the brink of rebellion. And you're stuck waiting, with nothing but air currents and gut feelings to guide you. This is why medieval bakers developed what can only be called a sixth sense. They didn't talk about fermentation times in hours or minutes. They talked in weather cues. The crust should rise by the second crow, someone might say, or if the chimney smoke folds, it's too soon to bake. If those sound mystical, well, they kind of are. But they weren't random. Most of these sayings had some basis in repetition and pattern recognition. A baker might bake 6 days a week for 30 years. Multiply that out, and you've got nearly 10,000 baking sessions under their apron strings. You'd start to notice patterns, too. One well-known tradition, especially in Germanic regions, involved the finger press test. Not the one modern bakers use. This was different. A baker would press a knuckle lightly into the proofing dough and say, "If the wind pushes back, she's not ready." It sounds like nonsense until you realize they were listening for how the air in the room responded to that quick indentation. If the room was too still and the dough too slow to bounce back, it meant the yeast wasn't activating fast enough, likely due to poor air movement or high humidity. So they'd wait, or sometimes do something bolder. You watch as the head baker cracks open the side door just for a moment, letting in a rush of air that scoops across the surface of the dough and makes the linen covers flutter. A gentle current, enough to stir things, but not enough to cool the oven. He glances at the hanging cloth, sees it sway just right, and nods. That's what you're seeing now. Air sculpting, not with machines, not with fans, with doors and windows and timing and trust. Historians still argue whether this level of environmental manipulation was conscious craft or a byproduct of building design. Some claim bakeries were constructed with airflow in mind. Arched ceilings, angled vents, chimneys positioned to create gentle draft corridors. Others say it was just lucky architecture and intuitive adjustment. But one thing's clear: baking was never static. If the air changed, everything changed. One misstep, one misjudged gust, and you might end up with a loaf that pancakes in the oven, rising too fast, then collapsing like a punctured tent. So bakers became win mathematicians in their own way. They developed internal equations like, if the door's open, the fire strong, and the breeze north-facing, cut fermentation by a third. Not written, just known. You glance around the bakery now and everything is moving, but nothing feels rushed. Loaves are proofing in layers, some near the fire for warmth, others nearer the door for a slower, steadier rise. The bakers rotate them like chess pieces, judging each one's readiness by touch, color, and airflow. It's an elegant game of temperature and texture. One misstep could throw the day, and yes, it happens. One of the apprentices, eyes slightly too confident, decides to slide a batch into the oven ahead of schedule. The head baker notices, narrows his eyes, and walks over. He doesn't scold. Instead, he pulls the paddle back out, pinches the dough, and whispers something, only audible to the oven. Then he waits 5 more minutes. Those 5 minutes saved the crust. You learn quickly that baking here isn't about brute timing. It's about feeling when the dough wants to bake, not when you want to bake it. That kind of discipline is hard to describe. It's not passive. It's not assertive. It's something in between, like gardening with wind. There's a strange serenity to it, honestly. You begin to feel like part of the room. You don't speak. You breathe slower. You notice the shifts in temperature on your skin, the flicker of firelight, the sway of the parchment gauge. It's almost meditative. And when the next batch of loaves goes into the oven, one by one like passengers boarding a quiet boat, you watch the bakers lean back just slightly. Not fully relaxed, but almost. They've done what they can. Now it's the oven's turn, and the wind's. The loaves are in again. This time, the second batch. You hear the soft scrape of wooden paddles, the low creak of the oven door closing, and the subtle shuffle of flour-coated boots across worn stone. But in the far corner of the room, something unexpected happens. A door opens, and through it steps a man not dressed like the others. No apron, no flour, no soot on his face. But everyone turns to greet him with quiet nods. He's not a baker. He's what you might call the wind informant. Every town had one. Unofficial, unrecognized by any guild, but vital nonetheless. Sometimes it was a retired miller. sometimes a rooftop chimney sweep, occasionally a beekeeper. But whatever their day job, they became the one person who always seemed to know what the air was planning to do. And they were treated with reverence. This particular man is wrapped in layers of wool, his fingers stained with ink and ash. He carries a small notebook and a bundle of feathers tied to a length of reed. He doesn't speak much. He doesn't have to. He steps near the bakery's central hearth, holds the feathers loosely in his hand, and watches how they sway. Then he nods. A simple, solemn motion. The bakers exhale. They've been waiting for this signal all morning. The wind informant was, in many ways, a medieval micrometeorologist, but his methods were anything but scientific. He'd rise early, climb to the church tower, wet a cloth with vinegar, and wave it to see how long it dried. He'd watch chimney smoke, not just its direction, but how it bent. He'd walk barefoot on roof tiles to judge how long the warmth held. It all sounds absurd, until you realize how accurate he often was. Some even called these people whisperers, others windwalkers. And if they whispered the wrong thing, entire baking days were thrown off, so bakers bribed them. Not with coin, with crust. A perfect heel of bread, crisp on the outside, steaming on the inside, could buy tomorrow's forecast. You ask one of the apprentices how they knew this man was trustworthy. He shrugs and says, "He smells the weather better than we smell dough." Which, coming from a baker, is no small compliment. Historians still debate whether wind informants were real professionals or just eccentric village fixtures. There's some truth to both. What's clear is that their role came from a desperate need to predict what couldn't be controlled. And for medieval bakers, nothing was more volatile than air. Today, this informant confirms something the bakers suspected: a gusty shift coming from the northwest. That means the current batch in the oven may brown faster on the crust and dry out more quickly at the edges. Adjustments are made immediately. Loaves are repositioned slightly, the chimney is half damped. A wet cloth is draped near the door to add moisture. None of this is panicked. Just precise. And the wind? The wind responds, or at least it seems to. You step outside with the informant for a moment. He lets you hold the bundle of feathers. You try. They flutter weakly, and he raises an eyebrow. Then he hands you a thin sliver of rabbit hide, oiled and curled. You hold it by the tips. It folds toward the ground. "Too heavy," he murmurs. "Air's sinking." That apparently is good for crust. He explains how some towns had local wind names, each with their own baking implications. In the Alps, a warm southern draft called the Faune was a blessing. In northern France, the grisailleur, a gray, soggy chill, meant dough would sit sullenly for hours. In Wales, a rolling, sticky mist called the Sidibem breeze was blamed for more collapsed loaves than any rat or thief. You start to feel like you're hearing a secret language. And in many ways, you are. Because these weren't just weather patterns. They were part of the baker's mythology. The unwritten manual passed down in stories and glances, not ink and parchment. Wind here wasn't just motion, it was meaning. You return to the bakery just as the loaves begin to sing again. Pop, crack, sigh. The bakers gather, listening. Some even close their eyes. It's like listening to a fire or the sea. Predictable, but never the same. And somehow each crack is a kind of Morse code, a message from the oven, a confirmation that despite everything, today's second batch is alive. One baker points to the crust and says, "Northwest edge." You see it, a slight bulge where the wind curled around the hearth. But instead of frustration, there's admiration. They're not fighting the wind, they're working with it. Like dancing with a partner who sometimes steps on your toes but also leads you towards something surprising. It's subtle, this kind of craftsmanship. Quiet, invisible to those not looking for it. But you're looking now. You watch the wind informant leave, feather bundle in hand, his notebook tucked under his arm. The bakers nod as he passes. No one thanks him. No one needs to. He'll be back tomorrow, and so will the wind. Or it won't. By now, you've almost forgotten what a world without ovens and rising dough smells like. You've been here long enough that the rhythms of this place, the low hum of coals, the muted shuffle of slippers on stone, the rustle of linen cloths peeled back from proofing bowls, have become your own. But today, something different awaits. In the far corner of the bakery, past the rows of resting loaves and stacked trays, a baker beckons you toward a small writing desk. Atop it lies an unusual parchment wheel, drawn in pale inks and slightly curled to the edges. Around its circumference are gentle curves and symbols that look more like sunbursts than letters. You're looking at a windrose. Not the maritime kind used for navigation, but a baker's version, designed to predict how the wind influences flour, and how that flour influences the dough, and how that dough, if you're not paying attention, might rise into disaster. You trace its edges with a finger. Each section is labeled with wind directions, north, south, east, west, but then there are sublabels in tidy medieval Latin. Crispum, mollis, humidum, gravis, crisp, soft, humid, heavy. Today, the baker says, we're on a split day. North gust with a southern belly. You blink, which apparently is enough to prompt an explanation. That means the surface wind, what hits your skin, is coming from the north, sharp and dry. But the ground level flow, sneaking under doors and through floor cracks, is from the south, heavier, wetter. The worst kind of day for light flour. The baker pulls a sack closer and opens it. You notice instantly the flour is clumping slightly heavier than it should be. He nods, not unhappily. Now we adjust. And this is where the flour forecasts come into play. You learn that medieval bakers didn't just measure flour by handful or volume. They watched how it behaved, how it clung to the hand, how it drifted in the air, how it absorbed the ambient humidity, and they charted it. That windrose? It's not decorative. It's part of a long-standing notebook system that some bakeries use to record wind-flour relationships. If the wind came from the southeast and the flour felt slightly gummy, add dry ash. If the wind pushed west and the flour felt like dust, mix the dough with water and reduce kneading time. You realize this is bacon meteorology. Primitive, yes, but remarkably sophisticated. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or isolated to elite guilds and monasteries. But there are references, buried in taxation records, inventory ledgers, even poetry, that suggest flour forecasting was taken seriously. In Bruges, there's an old tavern song about flour ghosts who ruin the loaves of bakers who ignore the breeze. A kind of ghost story, sure, but also a teaching tool. You try your hand at reading the windrose. A tiny arrow carved from bone is spun gently on the wheel. It points southwest. The baker nods. That means drier crusts, but unpredictable proofing. He adjusts the mixing ratio again. Less water, more kneading, and begins a new dough. You're handed a bowl. The flour inside feels silky. Too silky. The kind of texture that promises quick absorption, fast fermentation, and a very real chance of overproofing if the oven's not ready. So you knead carefully, slowly. The baker checks your progress and, for the first time, smiles without saying a word. You've passed the flour test, and while your arms ache and your wrists whimper, there's something deeply satisfying about this kind of precision. No apps, no timers, just wind roses and hands. It's easy to romanticize all this, to imagine a simpler time where people were more connected to their work, more present. But you also see the anxiety behind it, the need to predict, to adapt, to respond to the whim of something utterly invisible. The wind could bless your bread or curse it, and so they recorded everything. Windrose charts were passed down like family heirlooms, sometimes annotated in the margins with dates and initials. Some were shared, some were guarded. A few were rumored to be cursed if used by the wrong hands. You smirk at the thought, but when you look again at the one before you, inked in calm strokes, notations so fine they look whispered, you realize it's not superstition, it's respect. Respect for the thing that can't be seen, for the difference between a feast and a famine, for a breath of air that decides if the town eats or not. You help slide your new loaf into the oven. The door creaks shut, and for a moment, as the wind sighs through the open window and brushes against your cheek, you understand what it means to be a baker who listens to the sky. The oven door's closed, the embers tucked in, the loaves now left to their own devices in the womb of heat and stone. You lean back against the wall, fingertips still dusted with flour, wrists tingling from the kneading. But you're not the only one taking a pause. Around you, the bakers have entered what they jokingly refer to as the watch. That quiet window where everything's riding on how well you read the air, how patiently you waited, how precisely you shaped. All that's left to do is listen and smell. But not for long, because the most senior baker in the room is already moving, heading toward a shelf lined with odd little trinkets. Among them, a jar of scorched rosemary, a leather-bound notebook, and a small, tightly sealed pouch that, when opened, releases a wave of dried citrus and something faintly metallic. You know what time it is. Time to smell the wind. It turns out that long before chemical testers or hygrometers, bakers relied on the only sensors they had: their noses, their skin, their instinct. And among all the tools of their trade, the nose was king. You watch as he pinches a bit of flour between his fingers, rubs it lightly, then lifts it to his nose. Not to check the flour, but the air clinging to it. If the scent is too sharp, something's fermenting too quickly. If it's dull, not enough rise. He wrinkles his brow and mutters, "Southwest again." How can he tell? Apparently, every direction carries a scent signature, at least in this village. Northern winds bring cool, dry air that sharpens the tang of sourdough. Southern breezes carry moisture that softens the crust too soon. Eastern winds dry the air fast enough to cause surface cracking before the core is done. Western winds, mixed bag. You reach for a small dish of flour yourself and try the test. Nothing. To you, it smells like flour. But the apprentice beside you nods knowingly and says, "Give it another year. Your nose learns." You believe him, because this isn't just poetic nonsense. Even today, modern bakers talk about the scent of ripeness, of dough that has turned, of overproofing that smells too sweet. But in the medieval world, where there were no digital readouts or temperature logs, these perceptions were the rule book. You glance over at a young woman near the far window. She's not shaping dough or tending fire. She's just standing there, eyes half closed, facing the breeze. Her apron flutters slightly, and every few minutes she adjusts a small scrap of parchment taped to the window sill. It's marked with faint charcoal lines. What's she doing, you ask? Reading the layers, someone answers. Turns out in some bakeries, the job of assessing air layers, floor air, mid-room, overhead, was trusted to one person. Often the baker's daughter, or niece, or sister. Not always, but often. Because women, so the belief went, had better noses and longer patience. Some dismissed that as old superstition. Others treated it as gospel. Either way, women played a powerful role in wind reading. And in many towns they formed quiet, unofficial guilds, networks of female bakers who passed down techniques, remedies, flour blends, even rituals. They met at dawn before the ovens were lit, shared wind readings, compared notes, shared sourdough starters, yes, but also air knowledge. The men might have run the shop, but the women ran the wind, and they had their own tricks. In one record from a bakery in Bruges, it's noted that Sister Ellen would hang wet lavender bunches above the window. The way the scent drifted, or didn't, told her how to adjust her yeast. Another woman, known only as Berta, apparently hummed to her dough. Long, low tones. Not for superstition, but because she claimed she could hear how sound bounced in still versus moving air. It sounds ridiculous, until you remember that sound is vibration, and so is yeast. Historians still argue over the accounts. Were they eccentric rituals or proto-scientific experiments hidden inside kitchen lore? There's no consensus, but one fact stands out. These women made great bread, and they made it in conditions most modern bakers wouldn't dare try. You turn back to the apprentice and ask if these traditions still exist. He smiles and points to the parchment taped near the window. A faint gust curls its edge. "That's my sister's chart," he says. "Same one our grandmother used." And then, just like that, the wind shifts. Everyone moves. The oven doors opened, the heat billows out like a lion's breath, and the first golden crusts emerge. There's a rhythm to it. Paddle in, paddle out, a tap-tap on the surface, a quick listen to the loaf's soft crackling song. Each one is different. Slight variations in rise, crust color, spread. Not bad, not flawed, just influenced. By the air, by the hands, by the time of day. And you? You helped one of them. You feel it now. Your loaf is ready. It's marked with a tiny slit on the top like a wink. The crust is thick, the base firm, the color deep, just uneven enough to prove it wasn't made by a machine. It's yours. And it smells like patience, like wind and warmth, and learning something by feel. You cradle the warm loaf in your hands like it's something ancient and breakable, which, in a way, it is. It's heavy but not burdensome, firm but not stubborn. There's a subtle spring to its crust when you press your thumbs against it. You can feel faintly the give and resist of a well-developed crumb. And for just a moment, you swear it's breathing, but the story isn't over. Because before you can savor that feeling, the head baker returns and gently lifts your loaf away. Not to scold or question, but to assess. He places it next to others, each marked with a small glyph, carved into the crust with a blade before baking. Your mark? A soft double slash, now browned to perfection. He taps the base of the loaf. Tock, tock. A subtle smile. Then, to your surprise, he leads you into a back room. Dim, narrow, and lined with bundles of herbs, it feels more like a chapel than a kitchen. There's a long wooden bench against one wall and a small window through which you feel, rather than see, a faint, steady breeze. Here, you're told, is where the women of the wind once met. It sounds like folklore, like something scribbled in the back of a herbal grimoire. But in this village, it was real. Women who weren't part of the official bakers' guilds, because those didn't always allow them in, formed their own unwritten networks. They knew things no one taught aloud. They knew when to adjust flour for moon phases, because they swore the yeast behaved differently during a waxing gibbous. They knew which direction the wind should blow if you wanted a soft inner crumb, and which days to delay baking altogether. They knew how to fix a dead starter with chamomile tea. They knew how to keep ash from shifting the flavor by folding a fig leaf inside the firebox. You glance around the room. In one corner, you notice chalk markings on stone, a half circle bisected by 4 vertical lines. It's a crude wind diagram, each section labeled in Latin shorthand. One of the apprentices tells you that the diagram's original purpose wasn't navigation but proofing order. Depending on the wind direction, dough was placed in different corners of the bakery. Each spot had a personality, some cooler, some warmer, some gentler with air movement. You wonder if the wind noticed. The older bakers believe it did, that the air treated with respect returned the favor. One of them even claims to have heard the wind sigh once when a batch of loaves were left uncovered. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. Could have been a chimney draft, but it felt like disappointment. Back in this quiet chamber, you begin to understand why the women of the wind kept things to themselves. Not because they were secretive, but because they didn't need to prove anything. Their bread proved it for them. Still, there were whispers. Some towns accused them of witchcraft, flour that rose too fast, loaves that cooled too evenly, bread that stayed soft longer than it should have. Surely that was unnatural. There's one story, half myth, half record, of a woman named Altha who supposedly could trap air in a clay bowl and use it the next day to revive flat dough. She claimed it wasn't magic, just knowing where to place the bowl on a windy night. Of course, she was investigated. They didn't find any demons, only good bread. And so her reputation changed, not from witch to saint, but from outsider to advisor. By the end of her life, bakers from 3 towns would send couriers to ask for her readings. It said she never used scales, only wind. Historians still debate whether she existed. Some say her story was a blend of many unnamed women whose work was hidden behind the signature of male bakers. Others insist she was real, eccentric, brilliant, and deeply in tune with the invisible. You run your fingers along the old diagram again and wonder how much of what's lost today wasn't magic, but wisdom without vocabulary. Eventually, the head baker returns, holding your loaf. He places it on a cloth and gestures for you to sit. You do. And for a while, no one speaks. The wind trickles through the window. The loaf sits between you, cooling, whispering, and a tiny crust pops. He breaks off a corner, hands it to you. You chew. The crust resists, then yields. The crumb is soft but not wet, elastic but not chewy. You taste firewood, salt, air. Mostly, though, you taste balance of ingredients, of instinct, of wind. And as the baker leans back and closes his eyes, you get the feeling that he's not resting. He's listening. The bread is gone now, piece by piece, and you're left with only the lingering warmth on your fingertips and the silence between crackles. But even in stillness, the story continues. The baker, still seated beside you, begins thumbing through a notebook. Old, leather-bound, and soft at the edges like it's been read more than lived with. He doesn't read from it. He just holds it open to a page you can't see. Then he says, without looking at you, historians still argue whether any of this was science. You blink. Wind, he says. Flour, air pressure, the whispers, the charts, the way we test the room by smell, the way the crust sings or doesn't. He closes the book gently. They say it's all coincidence, that we were just making it up as we went, that it was chance, not craft. You want to ask what he thinks, but you don't have to, because this section of the story is about uncertainty, about how, for all the rituals and roses and finger press tests, no one's ever fully pinned down how much of baking is control and how much is surrender. The debates still swirl in the dusty corners of medieval studies departments. Was wind reading real or romanticized? Were those wind compasses truly functional or just symbolic? Were parchment charts actually useful or decorative? The answer, as always, is complicated. In some regions, especially among monastic communities, the documentation is meticulous. Weather records, yeast performance, baking cycles match to moon phases and wind flow diagrams. It reads like pre-modern data science. In others, all we have are songs, folk tales, recipes scrawled on the backs of prayers, stories of loaves baked under cursed skies or blessed gusts, of women who could smell the sour from 2 doors away. One 15th century Parisian guild record dismisses the whole wind theory, claiming that bakers seek excuses in air when they fail in practice. Another, this one from a Flemish village, argues the opposite. The wind teaches more than any master, for it knows no pride and cannot be bribed. You like that one? And as the baker finally turns the book toward you, you see what he's been holding. A page filled not with recipes, but with observations. Dozens of short lines, each beginning with a date and a wind direction. 4. May, light east, crust pale, rise slow. 7 May, northern chill, sweet aroma, crust blisters. 10 May, damp from south, overproofed if left too long. 13 May, no wind, no rise. These are the records of someone trying to prove a point no one else believed needed proving. This isn't folklore, it's curiosity. And even though no one back then would have used the word, what you're seeing is early experimental baking, a quiet rebellion against uncertainty, a belief that even in a world ruled by rain and fire and feudal lords, you could learn the language of air. The baker turns the page. This one has small symbols, like tiny wind roses, each with slashes through them. Some are annotated, burned too fast, dense loaf. Perfection. You ask if this was his notebook. He shakes his head. Grandmother's, he says. I just keep adding to it. You don't say anything. There's nothing to say, because you know now that this isn't a myth, it's a memory, a method, maybe even a map. And the most powerful part? None of it's been written in the official histories. Not the guild charters, not the civic scrolls, not the fancy parchment in state libraries. Just in margins, in notebooks, in bread. Because that's how knowledge survives sometimes, not through prestige, but through practice. Passed down from crust to crust, between cracked fingers and quiet rooms, embedded in the warm silence of shared understanding. You imagine a future historian, centuries from now, holding this notebook and wondering why someone cared so much about which way the wind blew before baking rye, and maybe they'll get it, or maybe they'll call it superstition. But you? You've been here. You've felt the room change with the shift of a breeze. You've seen a loaf rise because someone knew how to tilt a window just right. And you know what the baker knows. Even if we can't prove the wind matters, we still listen. You're back by the hearth now. Its warmth curling around your ankles, the scent of scorched crusts and ash still thick in the air. But something's shifted. Not in the bakery, not in the wind, but in you. This isn't just a story about bread anymore, it's a story about attention. About people who spent their lives watching something no one else noticed, listening to nothing in particular, trusting feelings that didn't come with footnotes. And now, for the strangest turn yet, the baker reaches beneath the bench and retrieves something that looks completely out of place in this otherwise earthen, firelit world. A carved wooden plaque. It's round, heavy, scorched on the edges. At the center, a single swirl, like a galaxy or a storm. Around the swirl, the words faint, Latin, half burned in, spiritus panis, Deus flat. The spirit of bread, God blows. He chuckles. Bit much, I know, he says. But that's what happens when theology gets into dough. You've entered the last strangest chapter of the wind baking saga, the time when wind became theology. In some regions of Europe, particularly during the early Renaissance, the line between divine influence and natural force began to blur. People knew that wind brought life. They saw it raise sails, scatter seeds, cool skin, and yes, raise bread. So naturally, they began to ask, what is wind really? And if wind is breath, and breath is life, you see where this is going. In several Benedictine monasteries, scholars began writing prayers for air. Literal prayers. Not for rain, not for sun, but for gentle crosswinds. For drafts that would neither chill the dough nor stifle it. They prayed for winds to stir the yeast but not shake the fire. You think this is metaphor. Until someone shows you an actual liturgical fragment. Breathe upon this oven, Lord, that the work of our hands might rise. That line was once sung during the feast day preparations, a choral blessing, a breath for the bread. Now, were all bakers turning to God to stir their starters? Not quite, but the influence crept in. In theological schools, air was sometimes described as divine whimsy, a thing without shape, without law, yet full of purpose. If the bread rose beautifully, some believed it had been touched by grace. If it collapsed, well, perhaps a sin lay unconfessed. There's a tale, probably more parable than history, of a baker monk who confessed not to theft or pride or impure thoughts, but to impatience with the breeze. I doubted the breath of the Lord, he wrote, and the dough bore witness to my unrest. You chuckle. It's a bit much. And yet, you've been here. You've waited beside dough that didn't rise. You've watched flour misbehave for reasons no one could quite explain. You've felt the moment when wind enters a room and everything subtly resets. Maybe that monk wasn't being dramatic. Maybe he just noticed. Historians argue whether this theologizing of the wind was sincere belief or rhetorical flair. Some see it as a reflection of how religious institutions dominated every aspect of life. Others view it as a sincere attempt to understand what couldn't be measured, but was felt. And here's the part that lingers. This belief made bakers slower, more patient, less mechanical. They didn't just knead and bake. They waited, prayed, read the breeze. Not because it was trendy, not even because it always worked, but because it honored the unknown. And isn't that what all good baking does? In a world full of certainties, it dares to say, we'll see. You glance back at the plaque. The swirl at its center looks a bit like rising steam, or wind, or spirit. And the baker, as if reading your mind, shrugs and says, maybe it was just a poetic excuse for loaves that collapsed. But then he adds, or maybe they knew something we've forgotten. The bakery is quiet now. Not silent, never truly silent, but slower, softer. The loaves have been baked, the flour swept, The fire's banked low. You hear the ticking of cooling crusts and the occasional creak of wood shifting as the heat seeps from the walls. Outside, the wind has changed again. You don't need a feather to tell you that. You just know. You've spent the better part of a day living as they lived, watching the breeze, kneading with intention, reading air like scripture. And now you come to the last act, the final loaf. It's one made not for sale, not for market, not even for prayer. It's made for remembrance. The baker retrieves a lump of dough from beneath a damp cloth. It's smaller than the others, scored with 5 simple lines across the top, one for each direction of the wind, and a final cut for the breeze you don't see coming. He tells you this loaf is baked at the end of each month. Just one. No more. It uses the last of the flour, the last of the fire, the last reading from the windrose. It's called the final breeze. It's not meant to be eaten. It's left on a wooden shelf near the hearth until it hardens into a crusted memory. Then gently it's crumbled and scattered in the fields, where the next season's grain will grow. It's a quiet tradition. No one writes about it, but every baker here does it. You help him shape the dough. He hands you the blade, lets you score the cuts. You press gently, just enough to remind the crust where to bloom. Then into the oven it goes, resting in the center, the fire whispering against the stone. While it bakes, the bakers begin their final tasks. Aprons are folded, tools wiped clean. The windrose is reset, its arrow gently turned to a resting point. The window is latched, but not all the way. Because wind, they say, should never be completely shut out. It needs to feel welcome, trusted, even when it betrays you, especially when it betrays you. As the final loaf emerges, its crust golden and firm, the head baker cradles it like a child and places it on the high shelf. No one speaks. They simply stand for a moment, eyes half-lidded, the air dense with steam and smoke and history. You look up at the shelf and see rows of hardened loaves from months past, each one marked, each one slightly different. A calendar of air, a diary written in crust, and then you feel it. The breeze. It snakes in through the slightly opened window, curls around your ankles, lifts the edge of the linen curtain. It's soft and cool and calm, and it carries nothing dramatic. No storm, no omen. Just closure. You stand still and breathe it in. And in that moment, it doesn't matter whether the wind was ever measured or read or obeyed. It doesn't matter if the wind compass was accurate or if the flower forecast were more poetry than physics. What matters is that people tried. They paid attention. They listened. They baked with care. And in a world where so much felt unknowable, disease, famine, war, they found one space where the breeze could mean something small and manageable and human. They made bread, and now so have you. And as the bakery dims, and the loaves sleep on their shelves, and the fire sinks into embers, you feel yourself becoming still. The stories settle, the air softens, and the wind? The wind tucks you in. Wind down. Now the room fades slowly, stone walls growing dim, firelight cooling to a low red pulse like a heart at rest. The sounds blur together, the faint sigh of a breeze outside, the long hush of cooling ovens, the breath of a space winding down after hours of motion and care. You're no longer a visitor here. You belong here. Among the ashes, among the shelves lined with bread ghosts, among the quiet craftspeople who learn to knead with one hand and feel the air with the other. You hear the final loaf shift slightly as its crust settles into stillness. A feather near the window lifts and falls. One last gesture, One last whisper. This world, built on fire and flower, intuition and patience, has held you gently, like dough between calloused palms. It hasn't rushed you. It hasn't demanded anything. It's only asked that you notice. And now that you have, you can rest. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the last bits of flour fall from your mind. Let the stories fold themselves up like linen cloths over a cooling batch. Let the breeze, soft and constant, be the last thing you feel. There's no more baking today, no more waiting, no more measuring. Only stillness, only sleep. And somewhere not far from here, a baker listens to the wind and prepares to begin again. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing journey. If this story brings you a sense of familiarity or evokes gentle memories, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments. Even if it's just a small dot, it's a wonderful way for us to know that you're connecting with the story. Every interaction like this helps us improve and grow. If you enjoy relaxing, peaceful stories with a touch of historical charm, please consider liking and subscribing, but only if you truly feel that what we offer is worth your time. Doing so will not only help you stay updated with our latest videos, but also serve as encouragement for us to continue bringing you more inspiring historical stories that make every moment of your day feel more tranquil. Thank you so much, and we hope to continue being a part of your peaceful moments. Let your mind relax with these warm and soothing tales, and don't forget to share your thoughts with us.